Doane Powell believed every face held beauty, character, or significance. He was fascinated by the details and differences expressed in a human face, and he put those qualities into mask form.
These masks were made by Doane Powell primarily in the 1930s through the 1950s. And they were really unique in the sense that they were made to be used in advertisements, in circuses, on television, in movies, theatrical productions.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome once again to Masquerade Party. Bobby Sherwood, there he is.
Powell also created masks of recognizable figures, a veritable who's who of the biggest names in politics and pop culture during these years. Many of them were household names at the time, and now are largely forgotten, a nod to the fleeting nature of fame. With an art degree from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, the Omaha-born artist spent years as a political cartoonist. He later moved to Paris to further his studies in art before ultimately settling in New York City with his family. That's when Powell's mask making took off.
A lot of people think that they're just paper mache, but he used this like laminated paper technique and just kind of really experimented.
Curator Jordan Miller, who works with 3D objects, was a bit taken aback the first time she saw the masks.
The thing that jumps out to me most is the fact that they are so lifelike. Every mask has their own box. You open the box, and it's like you're looking at somebody who was just beheaded because they're so real. And I think that's probably one of the things that's most striking about them. He seemed to be an eccentric artist. Then you go and see his masks, and they are super animated and exaggerated and colorful. This is another scrapbook we have in the Doane Powell collection. This one is, though, primarily of his apprentice, Carrie Hunt's career. This is a photo of Carrie and her husband, Doug. Here is Carrie with her daughter, Karen, who is the one who donated the Doane Powell collection.
Karen Schnitzbahn remembers meeting the eccentric artist after her mother, Carrie Hunt, reached out to Powell.
She wrote a letter to him, and she said she was very interested in learning how to make masks, and he invited her to come to his studio and to learn. I was only about 3 or 4 years old. My mom took me into New York with her, and it was so funny and so exciting. Doane Powell was sitting on a bench wearing a pig mask that had a little straw hat, and he was waving to me, and I thought it was a little bit scary, but it was the funniest thing as well. And then we went to his studio. He was very kind. I do remember the walls were covered with masks. It was quite a place. It was memorable for sure.
Both artists made hundreds of masks. Powell even wrote a book detailing his methods for making masks. When Doane Powell died in 1951, he left the collection in Hunt's care.
She often talked about him and missed him very much. He really gave her so much knowledge about mask making. She enjoyed her time at his studio. In her later years, she did tell me that she hoped that I would keep the masks and perhaps find a home for them. I started writing to so many different museums, and I got the same answer most of the time, that, oh, that's very interesting. We love those masks, but we just don't have any place to store them ourselves. I remembered that Doane Powell came from Nebraska.
Carrie's daughter, Karen, actually reached out to us seeing if we were interested in acquiring this collection, and we were. And it was really great because it wasn't just the masks, it's also archival material. We have a large photo collection that's all digitized and online. And then we also have 2 scrapbooks of Powell's political. It just really tells a fuller story of who Doane Powell was and Carrie Hunt and how the masks were made and used. He had a lot of really unique techniques, but then it also presented a lot of issues after they had been stored in a variety of conditions for decades.
The task of restoring these delicate creations fell to the conservators at the Ford Conservation Center in Omaha.
It was a unique challenge to try and figure out what he had used and how they could conserve it or restore it or, get it to its true likeness.
I find this one remarkable because it has a mixed emotion and there's a special degree of tension that's in this smile.
We have people coming and researching how he was doing what he was doing and how they can interpret that in their own work.
One of the measurements that I've taken is the pupillary distance, and on average, our pupils are around 3 inches apart.
One of
And
those
so
people
when
is
I
Adam
measure-
Houghton, a theater professor who teaches a class in mask performance at Brigham Young University in Utah.
They make up a remarkable collection as the work of an artist. For me, they have a meaning because the masks allow us to see things that we can't see in our daily life. For an acting student, it reveals all of this new skill set in terms of developing the body to be able to express all the emotions that the face can express.
Using Powell's book as a guide, Houghton made his own mask.
Wow, well, can I ask you a question?
I can't speak with it on, but
We may never know why Doane Powell and Carrie Hunt dedicated so much of their lives to the art of mask making, a cultural tradition dating back thousands of years.
it is a tool of transformation, and it links back to ancient practices and rituals, but it can also occur just in our celebratory moments when we put on masks like Halloween or dress-up parties and so on, where we then can open the door to another way of being.
Doane Powell was born and raised and worked and played in Nebraska for a long time. And then he went to Paris and New York. And so these masks just tell a national story as opposed to just a Nebraska story, which makes him just even more special.
My dad was a part-time magician, and my parents did magic shows, and they often used masks along with the magic. The newspapers in New Jersey used to go wild over the masks, and sometimes we would have reporters come and do photo shoots with the masks. And this was one of my favorite things, and I do remember this. My parents and I would be wearing the masks at some sort of a public place, and people would walk by and see these faces of these masks. Some of them were the funny ones, some were the world leaders, and they would just be so startled and taken back. And then when they found out their masks, they loved it. It was great fun.
For Karen, who grew up surrounded by these strange and wonderful faces, the masks carry a more personal meaning.
My bedroom was on the 3rd floor of our house. The 3rd floor had 2 bedrooms. So one of them was mine, and the other became the mask room. It was right next to my bedroom, so it was a little scary at night. I thought I would hear the masks talking to each other. I would have some nightmares about them. But there were also some masks that I felt were my playmates, my friends.